Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for the survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and for the next hour, hopefully, they're going to be the views of James Perloff, who's one of our favorite guests. James has been in this battle to save the world, to save America for many years. Back in the mid-1980s, he wrote a book going into the shadow government, and more recently his book going into the background of what's going on. The Truth is a Lonely Warrior. We carry both books. We advocate both of them. We think they're important. But James is a constant source of information, and we try to get him on as frequently as they can, because basically James is one of the few people who talks about the spiritual aspect of what's going on. You see, this is not a ideological or certainly a cultural battle we're involved in. It's a spiritual battle, and there really are people who worship the Prince of Darkness. There really are Luciferians. If you doubt that this is true, we advocate that you simply go to the website, trilateral.org. That's the website of the Trilateral Commission, and look at their logo. Why would they have picked a circle made up of 3 sixes joined together in the middle by an upside-down broken cross? Do you think that's just coincidence? And of course it isn't. They understand this is a spiritual battle. They understand that they serve the prince of this world. But the difficulty is that most Christians really look as Christianity as sort of an abstract idea, not necessarily as something practical of what's really going on today. But unfortunately, we truly are engaged in a spiritual battle for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization. Well, I'm simply hoping we're going to be able to get James Perloff on the line here, because certainly we look forward to his remarks. James certainly has been writing about this spiritual battle, and there truly are secret societies. They work at every level of our society today, and we certainly look forward to having certainly James Perloff. And if any of you out there, of course, have any experience with these secret societies, but they're there. Many times people, of course, will eventually leave them, and if they do, very often they're killed. James, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Stan, for having me on once again.
All right, fine. Well, what are we going to be talking about tonight?
Well, Stan, you and I have talked about this in a different time frame, but most of the people for tonight's audience will not have heard it. We're talking about the Lusitania.
All right, fine. I just did want to mention that today is D-Day, and Chris D-Day celebrates the American attack, or Allied attack on Europe during the Second World War. But what really most people don't understand is that American corporations, American banks, American oil companies financed and certainly built the weapons and armed the Germans all during the war, and so the weapons that were used there to defend the continent were manufactured by American manufacturers, just like the weapons that were used by our boys who went ashore that day. And this was simply another example of the degree of evil that exists today. They create wars. This World War II was fought to bring about a world government, just as World War I was fought to bring about a world government. And the sinking of the Lusitania, which we're going to be talking about, the Lusitania was actually sunk intentionally so that they thought it would bring America into the war in 1915. Fortunately, that failed. James, pick up the story.
Well, you're right about this being the anniversary of D-Day, and a lot of people do know about World War II. They have opinions about Hitler and World War II, but World War I has become almost a forgotten war. It was longer ago, but not that much longer ago than the Second World War, and some people might wonder about the relevance. Well, I do think it's quite relevant. For one thing, this month is actually the 100th anniversary of the...
Hold that thought. We'll be back in a moment. Okay, go right ahead, James.
Well, picking coming up this month is the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which touched off the First World War. And this was a war that took tens of millions of lives when we include disease, so it's certainly relevant. And it's also relevant for us always to understand the past because, as you've pointed out so many times, the past relates so directly to the present. And even though the names of the players may have changed, the same forces are at work for the same purposes. And as you pointed out, world government was to come out of World War II just as it was World War I. Well, let's pick up the story of the Lusitania now. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship on its way from America to Britain in May of 1915. And at this time, Britain was at war with Germany, but we had not yet joined the conflict. America was still neutral. Now, the ship was torpedoed. There were 1,200 casualties, including over 100 Americans, and the ship went down in just 18 minutes after a single torpedo hit in the South Irish Sea. It was the sea between Britain and Ireland. And this did not create an immediate declaration of war, but it was intended to, and it was actually the most important pretext in a series of justifications given for our eventual declaration of war. I should probably talk a little bit about why the Germans were torpedoing ships and why they were torpedoing a ship like the Lusitania. When the war began in 1914, the British had initiated a blockade, a total blockade of Germany. They were not allowing any merchant ships to pass, including American ships. And Germany was being starved out. Even by conservative estimates, several 100,000 Germans, including many children, died from the blockade. Well, the German Navy was hemmed in to port by the superior British surface vessels, and the only real weapon they had to retaliate against this blockade was their U-boat force. They tried to enforce a blockade against Britain, but they were only doing it against belligerent ships, British ships. They were not targeting American ships. And we should talk a little bit about why it was that the Lusitania was sunk without warning. When the Germans initially started their attempted U-boat blockade of Britain, their U-boats would always surface. They would warn cargo ships. They would fire a shot across the bow. They would allow the crew to debark in lifeboats, and then they would sink the ship. And this was according to international laws that have been established at places like the Hague Convention. And the reason they stopped doing that was because Winston Churchill, as head of the British Admiralty, unilaterally revoked what was called the cruiser rules of these international laws. What he started to do was to arm merchantmen.
Hold that thought.
Thanks.
We're going to be back in just a moment with James Perloff here. And this is Dr. Stan, and James is simply talking about the sinking of the Lusitania. Said it was sunk in 1915. And basically, of course, the reason that the Germans certainly had a submarine fleet was because the English had embargoed Europe, they had embargoed Germany, and basically there were hundreds of thousands of people in Germany, many of them children who'd starved to death because there wasn't any food. I mean, the embargo, the Allied embargo on Germany was ruthless. And as a result, they retaliated. They developed their U-boats, and of course, they tried to actually counter English embargo of Germany by a German embargo of England. And of course, when British passenger boats or British boats came, they were always warned. They initially warned ahead of time so that the people could get off the boats, so the crew could get off, the passengers get off. But Winston Churchill actually negated that so that there really was no way at all that the submarines could attack British ships, except certainly from underseas. Once if they surfaced, while the British would attack them in violation of all the rules and regulations that have been laid out, because Winston Churchill wanted an incident to bring America into the battle. So pick up the story from that point of view, the sinking of the Lusitania.
Exactly. Well, Churchill was arming these merchant ships, and even a small caliber cannon could sink a U-boat because the U-boats were not designed for surface warfare. And by the time the Lusitania went down, several of their subs had been sunk by merchantmen. In fact, the commander of the U-20, which sank the Lusitania, had actually just narrowly recently escaped an attempted ramming. And I'm going to quote Churchill because we're talking about him, what his motivation was in doing this. in arming the merchantmen. He wrote this to Walter Runciman, who was president of the Board of Trade. He said, quote, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany," unquote. And then here's what he said in his post-war memoir, The World Crisis. He said, quote, "The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is as serviceable as that which wins a great battle. The first British countermove made on my responsibility was to arm British merchantmen to deter U-boats from surface attack. As the U-boats were forced by the progressive arming of the British mercantile marine to rely on underwater attacks, they encountered a new danger. The submerged U-boat with its defective vision ran the greatest risk of mistaking neutral for British vessels and thus of embroiling Germany with the other great powers," unquote. So what Churchill is trying to do, he wants the U-boats to sink an American ship and have that be a pretext for an American declaration of war. But the Germans did not oblige. They were very scrupulous about which ships they sank, that they did not sink any American ships at this point. So the next best option for Churchill was, of course, to have a British ship sunk with Americans on board. And that became his goal. In fact, he asked Joseph Kenworthy, a commander in the political section of British Naval Intelligence, to issue a report on what the political impact would be if the Germans sank a British ship with Americans on board. And let's talk a little bit about foreknowledge of the Lusitanias being sunk, because that's important for people to know about. Our ambassador to Germany at this time was named Walter Hines Page. He was vigorously pro-British. He was also on the private payroll, while ambassador, of Cleveland Dodge, who was the top financial backer of President Woodrow Wilson during his campaign. And he was getting $25,000 a year to live in proper ambassadorial style from Dodge. This should not happen. This is the equivalent of a bribe. But let me just quote what Page wrote in a letter to his son on May the 2nd, 1915, 5 days before the Lusitania was sunk. He wrote, quote, "If a British liner full of American passengers be blown up, what will Uncle Sam do? That's what's going to happen," unquote. Walter Hines Page, our ambassador to Britain. Notice that he says it's going to happen, not that it might happen. And he says the ship is going to be blown up, not simply damaged or sunk. Another great quote, very revealing quote, comes from Edward Mandell House. Many of your listeners, I know you have informed listeners, Dr. Stan. Edward Mandell House was the controller of President Woodrow Wilson. He lived right in the White House. He was called Assistant President House by Harper's Weekly, and of course he was the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve Act, which profited the bankers so greatly. But at the time the Lusitania went down, Edward Mandell House was in Britain as special emissary of President Wilson. And on the morning that the Lusitania was sunk, he met with their foreign minister, Edward Grey. And here's what he wrote in a letter which you'll find in the intimate papers of Colonel House. Quote, "We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war," unquote. Now, later that very same day, House and Grey, the foreign minister, went out to Buckingham Palace and met with King George V. And here's what House wrote of that encounter. Remember, this is only about 2 hours now before the Lusitania was sunk. Quote, "We fell to talking, strangely enough, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He," meaning the king, said, "suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board," unquote. There's no way we can simply dismiss this, Dr. Stan, as simply a chance remark someone happened upon in a casual conversation. They're talking about the Lusitania being sunk about 2 hours before the event actually happened.
And I think the whole thing was slam dunk. What most people don't understand is that Colonel Edward Mandell House was evil. He was actually part and parcel of the other brotherhood. He was basically a Satanist. He was motivated by evil. His purpose was there to draw America into World War I and, of course, later to draw America into World War II. Go right ahead, James.
Well, that night the British were given a big dinner for House, and all the important British dignitaries were there, including Edward Grey. And when the news came the Lusitania had been sunk, House arose and announced that America would join the war within a month. And then Walter Hines Page cabled Wilson the next day, and he said, quote, "The freely expressed universal opinion is that the United States must declare war or forfeit European respect. If the U.S. does come in, the effect will be to bring peace and give the U.S. a great influence in ending the war and in reorganizing the world to prevent its recurrence, unquote, Walter Hines Page. I find this remarkable, Dr. Stan, in that just this is 4 years before the Paris Peace Conference, already Wilson, House, and Page are discussing ending the war and bringing about a League of Nations, which is quite remarkable.
But I think what's really what's so significant, ladies and gentlemen, as far as what's going on today, is we're heading to World War III. The same forces are at work in Washington, D.C. And when the League of Nations didn't bring about the world government, and when the United Nations didn't bring about the world government, World War III became inevitable. They're planning on it. Everything is in place. How soon it's going to begin, I do not know. But it is going to be used to bring about this one world government. And basically, it doesn't matter whether there's any justification for it. Millions are going to die, and I really fear this is going to be a nuclear war that's going to have a profound impact on America. Go right ahead.
And you're right. They used tragedy, disaster on a small or great scale to bring about the agenda that they want to achieve for their own evil purposes. Let's talk a little bit about the specific reason why the Lusitania was targeted by the Germans. It was not merely a passenger ship. It had been built with the financial assistance of the British government by the Cunard Line, but they were subject to a requirement from the British government in return for this assistance in building her and for annual subsidies they received to operate the ship, that they would turn it into a warship in time of war. And this is actually what happened. Winston Churchill told the chairman of Cunard in 1913 that war was approaching, and the Cunard's liners were refitted as auxiliary cruisers. The Lusitania was plated, and she was mounted for guns, and there was dispute about whether or not she had cannons. There is testimony that she did. I do believe it, although some authors dispute this. But the main reason that the Germans sank the Lusitania was her contraband. She was carrying 6 million rounds of rifle ammunition, 50 tons of shrapnel shells, 46 tons of aluminum powder, which is an explosive the British used. That was destined for their Woolwich arsenal. At least 15 tons of gun cotton, which they used in their mines. And so, but this was illegal, by the way, for American passengers to be on a ship carrying explosives. And Captain David Dow, the original captain of the Lusitania, after a few of these transatlantic voyages, informed Cunard he could no longer tolerate mixing passengers with munitions. He quit, and that's why he was replaced by Captain William Turner for the final fateful voyage. And I should also mention that the Germans tried to get Americans not to board the Lusitania. 2 weeks before the ship was to sail, their embassy ordered ads to be placed, warnings published in the newspapers near the Cunard sailing notices. They had a notice they wanted to go in 50 newspapers. I'll quote exactly what it said. Notice, big letters, capitals, exclamation point. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and Great Britain, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain do so at their own risk, unquote. That was a notice, but that notice, the publication was suppressed by orders of a State Department officer. They did get it published eventually when they got an audience with William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, who cleared it. He was an honest man. And Bryan asked President Woodrow Wilson if he'd please warn Americans not to board the Lusitania. Wilson declined to do so. He was on the banker's puppet strings, just as he had been when he helped to get the Federal Reserve Act passed.
And ladies and gentlemen, World War I was a totally contrived war. World War II was totally contrived, and all during World War II, why American corporations, American banks, American oil companies were building and certainly providing the weapons for the Germans. After all, you can't have a war unless you have an enemy, and I fear that this is exactly what's coming on today, and all this falderall about the barrier and the conflict between Russia and the United States and Russia and China. We're financing both of those companies. We're financing both of those countries. We're heading into a war, and the average American has little or no concept at all. We'll be back in a moment.
way.
No.
White with gold. God bless America. My home. Sweet.
Right, Pop? Right, son. Kind of makes you think of Blake, doesn't it? Makes you think of a lot of things. We're going to be in this yet, Mom.
Hi, Mom.
Hello, darling.
New song?
Brand new, first time in the air. Brand new, my eye. You know, I threw that song out of Yip Yip Yap Bang 22 years ago. Sounds better now.
Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest today is James Perloff. We're talking about the sinking of the Lusitania. And, of course, this is certainly apropos for today because World War I was contrived. World War II was contrived with over 60 million casualties. And, of course, I fear that World War III is upon us. And the average American find it so difficult to believe that most of what's going on today is totally engineered and is certainly a prototype and a repeat, playing over again of what happened in World War I when they sank the Lusitania to bring America into the World War I. Only this time I fear it's going to be a nuclear war, and hundreds of millions of Americans and hundreds of millions of people throughout the world will die in the coming Great War. Go right ahead, James.
Well, we were talking about the German attempt last to keep Americans from boarding the Lusitania. There's a lot of aspects to this false flag, and we should talk a little bit about how the British were fairly confident that this ship would indeed be sunk by a U-boat. Of course, there was no guarantee that the Germans were going to cooperate with this, but the Germans were pretty much in a catch-22 situation. If they did not sink the Lusitania, then all these tons of shrapnel shells and millions of cartridges would reach the front in Europe and kill German soldiers. If they did sink it, of course, it would be used for propaganda purposes by the British. Now, how do they know that the ship would probably be sunk by a U-boat? Well, the British Admiralty had broken Germany's naval codes, and so when a U-boat surfaced, they would intercept the messages, and they couldn't pinpoint the precise location of a U-boat, but they had a pretty good idea of the destinations and the general area of operations. And as far as the U-20, which sank the Lusitania went, it had been active in the South Irish Sea. They were well familiar with the fact that it was there from reports of its sinking of the vessels. Now, on May the 5th, which is 2 days before the Lusitania went down, Winston Churchill met in the map room of the Admiralty with his first Sea Lord, Lord Fisher, and the Commander Kenward of the British Naval Intelligence. And they had a great grid there showing all the hostile ships and the British ships marked with pins. And the U-20 was there, and the Lusitania was there, and they were on a collision course. And Joseph Kenworthy wrote in his book, Freedom of the Seas After the War, quote, "The Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with their escorts withdrawn," unquote. Now, I should mention, this is important, there were no escorts for the Lusitania. This is very unusual. on previous voyages when the Lusitania sailed and there was a submarine threat, there would be destroyers accompanying her. But in this case, no destroyers were sent out, even though there were 4 destroyers lying idle in the nearby port of Milford Haven. And they were not even searching for the U-20, even though it had sunk 2 steamers the day before it brought down the Lusitania. The only ship sent to escort the Lusitania was an aging cruiser called the Juno, and ironically, the Juno itself was recalled and sent to the port of Queenstown on Ireland's southern coast on the pretext that she was too slow and there was a risk she could be sunk by the U-boat. But no such diversion to go to Queenstown was sent to the Lusitania. Now, the Admiralty had several options to save the Lusitania. They could have rerouted the ship around the north of Ireland. She was headed for Liverpool, and she could have safely gone around the north of Ireland, where there were no U-boats operating, and the British knew that. Another option would have been to send it to Queenstown, and the other option would have been to send a military escort. They did none of those things, however. And there were communications between the Lusitania and the Admiralty, but strangely enough, the transcripts of those transmissions are all missing from the Admiralty's files. And many people think that the captain of Lusitania asked for permission to reroute the ship. He didn't have that authority to do it on his own, Captain Turner. And he was probably refused, but we don't know because the files are conveniently missing. I'd like to quote an authority on all of this. It's Patrick Beasley. He was long an officer in British Naval Intelligence. He was actually the man who would move the pins on that map that I was talking about on the grid in the Admiralty's map room. And he's considered the leading authority on the history of British Naval Intelligence. Here's what he wrote in his book, Room 40, quote, "Nothing, absolutely nothing was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval," unquote. Patrick Beasley.
And he's writing about a conspiracy, ladies and gentlemen. There was a conspiracy. They wanted that ship sunk. They wanted the Americans to die, along with the others, as a justification for getting us into the war, just exactly on September 11, 2001. Why, of course, they wanted those buildings to come down. And if you doubt that this was a controlled demolition, just go up on the Internet and put in Building 7 and watch Building 7 come down. Building 7 was a controlled demolition. They killed 3,000 people that day to get us into another senseless war.
Don't be late.
No.
White with gold. God bless America. My home. Sweet
Right, Pop? Right, son.
God bless America, land that I love. Guide her and guide her through the night with a light from above.
Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is James Perloff. We're talking about the sinking of the Lusitania. James, if people would like to get in touch with you, get in touch with your ministry, how can they reach you? Do you have an email address, a telephone number, anything of that sort?
Yes, people should go to my website, which is jamesperloff.com, and Perloff is P as in Peter, E-R-L-O-F-F, jamesperloff.com. There's a contact form there. And also, we're talking about the Lusitania. I should mention that it's the most recent article on my blog. So you click on the blog on that website, an extensive article documenting all of this with footnotes on the Lusitania. You'll find it. It's got more than 40 graphics from that era. Also, information about my new book, which is an update of The Shadows of Power. It's called Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And, of course, that one is stocked by your own Radio Liberty ministry.
That is Truth is a Lonely Warrior. You can get that from William, from James. You can get it from us. But it's important that you understand the background of the issues that led up to where we are today, because I fear that suddenly what has happened in the past is déjà vu all over again. They're planning on a major World War III, and heaven help the American people. Go right ahead, James.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what was going on with Lusitania. The ship weighed 32,000 tons. When it was first launched in 1907, it was the largest ship afloat. It sunk in just 18 minutes after being struck by one torpedo that had just 278 pounds of explosive. That's how much was carried on this type of torpedo. Now, there were two explosions. There was one from the torpedo, and then there was a mammoth explosion, and that's what sunk the vessel. The bow of the ship was almost immediately submerged underwater. And so why did it explode? Some in Britain tried to say it was the boiler rooms, but since sailors survived from every one of the active boiler rooms, we know that wasn't true. There's several theories on what actually caused the munitions to detonate. There were several explosives there. I mentioned these at the outset of the program, and one was gun cotton, a very powerful explosive. And I should mention that there's rather an interesting anecdote in connection with that. The British naval attaché in Washington was named Captain Guy Gaunt. There's an affidavit in the archives of the Justice Department given by a chemist named Ritter von Rettig. He was called to the offices of Gaunt a few days before the Lusitania sailed, and Gaunt asked him what would happen if seawater came in contact with gun cotton, and Ritter told him it would be very dangerous if the unstable kind called peroxylin was used. It would have to be in a watertight container, otherwise it could cause chemical reactions that would cause the gun cotton to explode. Well, the very next day, Gaunt went to the DuPont Munitions Company, and thereupon tons of the peroxylin were sent to the Cunard Wharf and loaded onto the Lusitania in 40-pound, not watertight containers, but burlap bags. And after making this affidavit, the chemist, Ritter von Rettig, was arrested. He was tried in camera. He was charged with making statements prejudicial to the peace of the nation, and he was imprisoned. And on the other hand, Captain Guy Gaunt was promoted to Rear Admiral and knighted. An interesting story there. It doesn't prove anything, but there are other theories I should mention. Patrick O'Sullivan, in his book on the Lusitania, thought it was the aluminum powder, a very explosive substance, which was headed for the Woolwich Arsenal of 46 tons on board. And others believe it was the percussion fuses for the shrapnel shells that were set off by the torpedo. Nobody knows for sure, but there were enough explosives on board, and the explosion that sunk the Lusitania did originate in her cargo hold where the munitions were kept.
Okay, we'll go right ahead, James.
Yes, well, I should talk about the cover-up. There's always a cover-up, right? There was one after Pearl Harbor with the Roberts Commission. Well, after Lusitania sunk, the British...
Don't forget about the cover-up they had for 9/11. Basically, there's a new report out on this. We'll be covering that next week, certainly on our programs, but they could not let the American people know they killed all those people on September 11th so they could get us into the war in Afghanistan, that war which is still going on today. And so basically they had a cover-up report, but there's a new report going to be coming out next week that definitely proves, beyond any shot of a doubt, from an impartial, a peer-reviewed committee, that essentially Building 7 was a controlled demolition, as was taking down of the buildings, the Twin Towers, which means that they murdered 3,000 Americans so they could get us into the Afghan war. It's like deja vu all over again. Go right ahead, James.
There's so many of these deja vus. Well, in the case of Lusitania, the cover-up was instituted by the British Admiralty. Of course, they're the ones responsible in the first place, and hundreds of bodies were washing up on the shores of Ireland, and the British Admiral sent a message to Vice Admiral Coke. He was in command of British defenses there in Southern Ireland, and they said, quote, ensure that bodies selected for the inquest have not been killed or mutilated by means which we do not wish to be made public, unquote. Now, what means could that be other than mutilation from the ship's munitions? But they needed a scapegoat, and they selected the captain of the vessel, Captain Turner. Richard Webb, who was director of the Admiralty's Trade Division, wrote this. He said, quote, one is forced to conclude that he, meaning the captain, is either utterly incompetent or was got at by the Germans, unquote. Admiral Lord Fisher, was second in command to Churchill, said, quote, he's not a fool but a knave. I feel absolutely certain that Captain Turner of the Lusitania is a scoundrel and been bribed. I hope he will be arrested immediately after the inquiry, whatever the verdict or finding may be. And finally he noted, quote, ought not Lord Mersey to get a hint, unquote. Now, I should mention that Lord Mersey was the justice who oversaw the hearing on the Lusitania. He had also, interestingly enough, overseen the Titanic hearing. Churchill then responded, quote, we shall pursue the captain without check, unquote. And here's a quote for you. Lord Mersey was written to by Captain Webb, who said, quote, I am directed by the Board of Admiralty to inform you that it is considered politically expedient that Captain Turner, master of the Lusitania, be most prominently blamed for the disaster, unquote. So here we have a situation, Dr. Steen, where even before the inquiry had begun, the judge had been told who to find guilty. I should mention that Mersey suppressed all evidence during the hearing, which was much of which is held in camera in secret. Any evidence of cargo, he never even asked the captain what his cargo was. However, he refused to crucify Captain Turner, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Captain Turner was an able veteran seaman, and no significant evidence was produced in court to incriminate him. And also, Winston Churchill, by the time the verdict was rendered, had been kicked out of the Admiralty. He had been dismissed due to the Dardanelles campaign, which had been a disaster for the British military. But Admiral Mersey, after the trial, asked that he no longer be assigned any justice duties, and he told his children, quote, the Lusitania case was a damned dirty business, unquote. I should probably mention next, well, what did they expect to get out of this? Of course, they wanted a declaration of war. And I think that, Dr. Stan, they're really looking back at the Maine. When the Maine was sunk in 1898, they got very quickly a declaration of war against Spain. But in 1915, it was different. In the case of the Maine, the press, the yellow press of William Randolph Hearst had already built up an intense hatred of Spain with fabricated stories of Spanish oppression in Cuba. But the American people were not that upset about Germany. They were upset about the Lusitania, but they saw no reason to go to war. And the case for war over the Lusitania was extremely weak. For one thing, it was not lost on a lot of Americans that Britain was the first to violate international law, not the Germans. Also, it was getting around, despite attempts to cover it up, that the Lusitania did have munitions on board. This was brought out by Senator Robert La Follette. And also, I should mention that Americans could go to Europe without any risk. They could travel to Britain on an American ship. There was no need to go on a belligerent ship belonging to Great Britain, because the Germans were not targeting American vessels. You did not have to go on a ship like the Lusitania. You were free. There was no inherent right of Americans to travel on belligerent ships. Woodrow Wilson tried to say he tried to say this was a sovereign right, but there was no precedent for it. In fact, I should mention that President George Washington had said that any American cargo vessel that went into a belligerent zone where America was neutral was not under the protection of the U.S. Navy. And the British themselves, during the Russo-Japanese War, had warned their citizens not to board belligerent vessels, that they could not be protected. So there was no precedent for Wilson's position, and he could not get the declaration of war. America was not ready. And so people like to scoff Dr. Stanley, say, well, obviously it wasn't a false flag because there was no declaration of war. No, they didn't get it right away, but they certainly intended to. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for America, the mood of opinion among the Congress and the people was not yet ready for war.
Okay, well, let's go right ahead because, of course, the war did come, and it certainly was a terrible tragedy. They intended it to get us into the war. Fortunately, the good judgment of the American people were not willing to go along with the senseless war. They didn't want to go to war in 1915, but they didn't want to go to war in 1917. The only thing is that they had 2 more years of propaganda to manipulate them into this war. Wars, ladies and gentlemen, every one of them are contrived, and most of them are contrived today to bring about this eventual one-world government which is coming. Go right ahead.
Yes, and that's just what they were aiming for from this war as well as other things. Well, you're right. They had to build up like a clamor for war, and so books and movies started appearing about the danger of a German invasion. This was absurd because the British couldn't even get out of the Germans couldn't even get out of their own ports with their warships because they're hemmed in by the British Royal Navy. But there was for example, there was a movie, and you'll see a scene from it in my website on the blog on the Lusitania. It's called The Cry of Peace, 1915, and you'll see the Huns who've invaded New York City, and they're groping the young virtuous maidens of New York City, and people being told that there was this imminent danger of German invasion. Of course, they had no intent of that. There's never been the slightest bit of evidence for that. But Wilson, in the meantime, he tried to play a jousting game with the German government. After the Lusitania was sunk, he sent the Germans an ultimatum and demanded they stop all submarine warfare, which, of course, they couldn't do. And they responded that it was Churchill who'd broken the cruiser rules, and they even provided a copy of Churchill's orders to Wilson, which they'd gotten off of a captured merchant ship. And they also pointed out the Lusitania was carrying munitions, and President Wilson sent a reply that this was not true, that the United States had scrupulously made sure there were no munitions on board. Well, William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, refused to sign that statement. He knew it was false because Wilson had already been advised by the Collector of Customs in New York, Dudley Field Malone, that almost everything on board the ship was contraband. So William Jennings Bryan, at that point, he was an honest man. He resigned as Secretary of State, but unfortunately he was replaced by an insider, Robert Lansing, who was the uncle of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who, of course, were leading insiders of politics in the 20th century. But they kept up this jousting game. Every time there was an incident, some minor incident where an American got injured on a belligerent ship, Wilson would again try to get Germany to break relations, and Germans said, well, look, we won't sink any more passenger ships, but if you want us to observe international law, you've got to get the British to do the same thing. Well, if you look in your history books, it'll say that Wilson got his declaration of war in 1917 because Germany resumed unrestricted sub-warfare, and that's true, they did. But remember, they made their pledge on the condition that Britain reciprocate, and Britain never did. But President Wilson held Britain to a different standard than he did to the Germans. And, of course, that kind of hypocrisy is just simply par for the course with the Illuminati and the people who run our presidents.
You're absolutely right. And most people don't understand that all of these wars are contrived. And, of course, we're heading into another terrible, terrible war. And the average American is never going to hear about this because of the degree of control that exists today over the mass media in the United States, and then over what the American people have been led to think and believe. Go right ahead.
I should mention that Wilson had to back off a little bit in 1916 because he was up for re-election. And it's interesting that the America wanted to stay out of war. And as a result, the Republican candidate, Charles Evan Hughes, had a huge lead over Wilson in the polls because people were picking up on the fact that Wilson was trying to push us towards war. So what happened was, you might recall that some of you readers, listeners, I'm sure know that Teddy Roosevelt was used to get Wilson elected. He broke up the Republican Party by running on the Bull Moose ticket in 1912, which split Republican votes and gave the election to Woodrow Wilson, even though he only had 42% of the popular vote. Well, they trotted out Teddy Roosevelt one more time in 1916. Teddy Roosevelt began going around the country making pro-war speeches denouncing Germany and saying that anybody against the war was a mollycoddle. Well, that's not how Charles Evan Hughes felt, the Republican candidate, but nonetheless, people by association thought that he was pro-war. In the meantime, the Democrats caught on, and they made Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." The irony is that Wilson got reelected in one of the closest presidential elections in history, the election of 1916, because Americans wanted to stay out of war. But as soon as he got reelected, he again picked up the war ball, and he moved to get that declaration of war, which he did achieve in April of 1917.
And tragically, of course, then America is drawn into World War I, a totally senseless war. We had over 100,000 deaths and another 400,000 casualties. And of course, then there were about 20 million people, 21 million people, and all died. And then, of course, we had the great epidemic following that. Another 21 million people died, and all for naught, all totally manipulated. Go right ahead, James.
You're very right to bring up those casualties. This war is relevant, and those people are not forgotten to God, even though they may be forgotten in general by people in this day and age simply because it was 100 years ago. But let's talk a little about why the Illuminati wanted to get us into this war. There were actually several reasons. Of course, the public purpose was that this is a war that will end all wars. And, of course, it failed in that purpose, but it did succeed in the purposes they had. And in my article, which you'll find on my website, jamesperloff.com, I list 7 of them. One was to restructure the world. They need that for their New World Order. And so empires were destroyed. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, Germany was dismembered. 6 monarchies, 23 duchies and principalities were shuttled aside to make way for this new system. And, of course, that was to bring about a world government that would oversee the restructured world, which is the second purpose. And the world government, the first formal one was achieved. That was the League of Nations, which was proposed by Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference. And it was not his idea. It was written really by Edward Mandell House, and you can find that out both from the official biographies of Woodrow Wilson and Edward Mandell House. But, of course, the Bible warns us that the Antichrist is going to rule the world. Well, to govern the world, Dr. Stan, you need a world government. That's what world government's about. That is what the League is about. It was satanic. Another purpose, of course, was to ignite the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's interesting that Jacob Schiff, who was one of the top 3 financial backers of Woodrow Wilson's campaign, was the chief financier of the Bolshevik Revolution also. And I'm sure it's known to many of your listeners that Schiff sent Leon Trotsky, the revolutionary from New York in 1917 to Russia with $20 million in gold on a ship with 275 other terrorists. They were detained in Canada, in Halifax, by the Canadians. And the reason that he was arrested by the Canadians was that I'll pick that up after the break.
Go ahead. We'll be back here in just a moment. Our guest, of course, is James Perloff. And basically, of course, this whole World War I was contrived, as was World War II, as the coming war.
While the storm clouds gather.
James, you go right ahead. We've got 3 minutes to wrap up the program.
3 minutes?
3 minutes.
Okay. Well, then the other purposes of the war included, in addition to the generating the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the advancement of the Balfour Declaration, by which Britain promised Walter Rothschild, the banker, to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and that's really why the British invaded Palestine. That, of course, was to set up ultimately the throne of the Antichrist. A 5th purpose was to destroy the progressive movement here in America, just as the Spanish-American War had nullified the populist movement with a new enemy, Spain. Bringing about a new enemy in place of Wall Street, namely Germany, really ended the progressive movement that had been led by people like Charles Lindbergh Sr., Congressman, and Senator Robert La Follette. A sixth was profiteering. The banksters made $6 trillion that they defrauded the American public out of for munitions that were never produced. We paid $1 billion for airplanes that were never produced. All this was brought out by the Graham Committee, which investigated war munitions fraud after the war. And all those munitions purchases were made under the oversight of Bernard Baruch, another one of the top financial backers of Woodrow Wilson, who Wilson made head of the War Industries Board. And the seventh and final purpose was the suppression of civil rights through the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which actually made it illegal to oppose production of war items or the selling of bonds. You know, they had these Liberty loans where Americans would buy bonds to support the war. Well, for the first Liberty loan, $400 million went directly into the pockets of J.P. Morgan and Company to satisfy debts owed by the British government. So much fraud. You'll find all this on my website, jamesperloff.com, under the blog. Just click on the blog. You'll have all the details on the Lusitania and the strategies that brought us into World War I. Very much a mirror of what's taking place in our world today, Dr. Stan.
Well, we're living in very, very difficult times. Certainly, they intend to have a great crisis. The third, suddenly, revolt is going to be coming on, and I really fear there's going to be terrible changes in America. I believe an awful lot of people are going to get killed, and I think we're probably going to be dealing not with suddenly millions, but hundreds of millions of forces of person holdings of person meetings that are going to be held. I want to thank you very much for being with us, James. It's always fascinating to have you with us, and we'll look forward to having you with us again in the near future, talking about this move towards the one world government and the one world tyrannical society. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being such a faithful servant. Thank you, Dr. Stan.
This is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, and this is the time when I need to remind our listeners that my ministry, Radio Liberty, is primarily listener-supported. And certainly, and basically we're trying to get people to understand that most of the things that are going on today are totally contrived, that there's this very, very small, well-organized group of people who want to bring about a one-world government. They probably don't make up more than 2 or 3% of the population of the world, but these are inherently evil people. And until people understand that, it's going to be very, very difficult for the average American to understand the true nature certainly of the demonic forces that are at work within the world today. Well, basically, because Radio Liberty is on the front lines of this battle, and our job is to get people to understand that we're involved in a spiritual battle that is being fought for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization. And of course, we can't do this without your help. If you're in a position to help us financially, our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. And you can certainly subscribe to the Radio Liberty family of supporters. You can listen to our radio programs there, certainly at that site. And because they're live 4 hours a day, they're archived 24 hours a day. Your job is to get the information out as far and wide as we possibly can so that the average individual will understand the true nature of what's going on today. And because ordinarily, the average individual listen to the radio is suddenly swayed because, of course, the control of the media is very, very widespread. There are certainly 6 major corporations in the United States that control 90% of the the media in the United States as a result. Why, of course, the average American has no idea, understanding that these cover both the conservative and liberal. They're not in favor of preserving America. They pretend to be, but all of it is to suddenly divert you away from the fact that we're involved in a spiritual battle for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization. So we ask you, if you're out there in America, to pray for America. We ask you to pray for our leaders, for our ministers, and for certainly and hopefully to encourage other good people to get involved in the political process. But without your help and support, there's no way in the world that we are going to be able to certainly reach people across America and keep America headed towards a one world, certainly a free society. There are people working at the highest levels of our government who want a one world government under truly demonic control. This is not imaginary. This is really very, very real. These people are well organized. They're very well financed. And quite frankly, we need your help. We cannot reach people without your help. So we ask you, of course, if you're in a position to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters, suddenly give us a call at 1-800-544-8927. We need your financial help. But more than that, we need your spiritual help. We need you to tell others about our program, to encourage them to listen, and to understand that the things that are taking place today are not accidental. They are part of a carefully coordinated effort on the part of a very small group of truly demonic beings, and these people are demonic. But their effort is to bring about this one world government, one world financial system, and certainly to regulate every aspect of life in our society. So, of course, we ask you to pray for America. We ask you to pray for revival. We ask you to pray for our leaders and our ministers, but we ask you to pray for my ministry, Radio Liberty, for our provision and for our protection. And we're going to be back here in just a moment or two to line up the next program right here at Radio Liberty.
Is that it, Grandpa?